Okay, thank you everybody. As you know, I'm David Good. I should say at the outset, I'm not an economist. But Gavin did put a challenge to me when he first thought of this meeting. We have some things starting. How do we build on that and how do we build momentum? And so, taking that as my exam question, I looked at the things I did know a lot about. So I've worked a lot with people who have tried to take what goes on in the university and use that to deliver value in the world. Working a lot with engineers, sometimes with people in medicine, and look at the ways in which they think about these sorts of things. In particular, one of the things that comes out very strongly is that implementing ideas from the university on the ground is often a matter of understanding what else needs to be brought to the table to achieve the implementation. Rarely does theory dictate for you, rarely does research discovery dictate for you exactly what you should do. You have to craft the intervention in light of the discoveries, but what you craft is not the discoveries. There's some very interesting challenges in going from what we have in the academy to what we have out there in the world. You see this very interestingly in work in medicine. There was a movement that started back in the 80s and 90s, began at Stanford, on what was called translational medicine. Because people understood that you're making terrific discoveries in the laboratory, but this wasn't really actually manifesting itself in what was happening in clinical practice. So the focus became on that pathway from bench to bed, or from lab to jab. And what you discover if you study that pathway is it's not a smooth, easy pathway. You have to have ways of understanding it, where the pinch points can be, where it can fail, and what ultimately deliver matters. So I'm going to be drawing on quite a lot of analogies from work in that kind of sphere, work that typically hasn't made its way much into areas of the social sciences. I mean, Eric was saying earlier how we can't do the kinds of things in the social sciences you can do in the natural sciences. So how do we think about that model that's over there in engineering, in medicine and other disciplines? How do we bring it across to what we're doing in the social sciences to help us understand what we have in hand now and take that through to meaningful outcomes? So these are suggestions on that front, and they're drawing from those other places. So having worked a lot with tech companies, big companies like Boeing and others, one of the things you get put your way is this, the higher catechism, which when you're used to talking within the university with your university colleagues of one sort or another, suddenly this is like a bucket of cold water at times. Suddenly you're not talking to people who know what you're talking about, you're talking to people who are outside your world. First part of the catechism, as you can see from the bottom, George Harmeyer was the DARPA director when he put this together. How do you articulate it in plain, straightforward terms so that people can understand you? If you're within the academy, you talk to the outside world, they often don't understand you. If you're in the outside world, you're trying to explain what you're trying to achieve, you don't articulate it in ways the academy can understand. So actually, at the very first point, if we're doing these impact and university research collaborations, articulation of the language and the problem becomes a really important issue. And then thinking of doing some very standard things. If you go through this list, and I won't read them all out, I'll come back to them later. But actually, think about what we've got in hand with what Gavin's been proposing. How does it stack up on this? Well, he had his action plan at the start, I think commendably articulate in various ways. Have we really thought enough about what the limits are of current practice? Maybe yes, maybe no. So that's, if you like, the background. I'll come back to this at the end. And I thought I'd start with a little piece of economic policy history, which I have to say I learnt from the man on the top left. Now, I don't know how many of you are Manchester music fans, but if you are a Manchester music fan, you will recognise the man on the top left. I see a couple smiling over there. That's Tony Wilson, a graduate of this institution in one of those completely useless subjects, English, who went back to Manchester and was a great innovator and developer of the economy and the economic activity in Manchester. So what's the story? Well, the person below him is not Mr. Lee. Some of you might recognise her. Any guesses? Margaret Thatcher, aged 13. Picture was taken by a Mr. Lee. Now, she came up with something in the early 80s when we had high levels of youth unemployment called the Enterprise Allowance Scheme. As Tony Wilson pointed out to me, that was terrific for the Manchester music scene. Terrific for the Manchester music scene because the Enterprise Allowance Scheme allowed you to claim 40 quid a week if you started a business. So lots of kids in Manchester interested in music started a band. The band was a limited company. They got the 40 quid a week. The Manchester music scene provided all the kind of support arrangements that we were hearing with Stepladder Plus. And lo and behold, the Manchester creative economy took off. A wonderful unintended consequence. I've worked a lot over the years with colleagues in Salford and Manchester. That's a picture of Manchester in the early 80s. Industrial destruction of one sort and another. It was a terrible time for the North West. But there's one of the products of it. Again, some of those from a certain period and a certain interest will recognise them. This is Joy Division. That's Ian Wilson there in the middle. So anyway, just when one goes down the road of being the younger folks' control, in a context where there's an understanding of what you're meant to do with that money, you actually get very interesting outcomes. Ones that might well have horrified the person who started it, the then Prime Minister, but working with a local like that, I mean, she didn't work with him, but his presence made that happen. So when we think about what we're doing now, we have an intervention, we have a way of understanding it, we have unintended consequences. So how can we look across to engineering and similar subjects to help us think about what's going on here? Well, a number of you may know this scale. It's called the Technology Readiness Level Scale. Developed by NASA, again, probably about 50 years or so ago, to look at the way in which they were funding research and the way in which it delivered through to actually the launch of a space vehicle, for example. Part of this story here shows that times we have basic technology research, we don't know where it's going to lead to. Sometimes we're actually doing research on test, launch and operation. Very focused on the end delivery. And we have a series of things in between. We have feedback loops between them, and we have, if you like, a story of how we should think about what we've got in hand. And I'm proposing that when we think about what's going on with the research we have so far and what else we might do, this provides something of a frame which I'll adapt in just a minute. With Gavin's plan of action, I think we have some sense of satisfying the Harmonic Catechism and how we think about really what we're seeking to achieve. But two things, and I've mentioned these already, two things are worth bearing in mind. When you go down one of these pathways, you discover that actually have very unintended consequences at times. Things don't work out as you wish. I'm sure Margaret Thatcher had no idea the Enterprise Allowance Scheme would end up supporting groups like the Smiths that supported gay rights. That was not an intended outcome, it was one of the outcomes. Hacienda Club, an all-night rave and 24-hour party people, not an intended outcome, but great for the Manchester economy note. Lots of individual actors. Also, as I've said already, the implementation outcomes rely a lot more on the way in which you would have other things brought to the table than perhaps at times the original research. So just for a question of political balance, anybody's Russian any good here? No, not a single one.
Believe it or not.
What?
Says what? Что терапии?
It's a famous line from a 1906 paper by Lenin. What is to be done? When you're trying to have the dictatorship of the proletariat, and bastards won't pick up the story, what do? We create democratic centralism, as it was put. So how do we take this idea and start moving across to what we have in hand from this activity? And then how do we build momentum from it? Well, people recognising, I'm not the first to recognise, I should rapidly point out, that what we see with technology readiness levels could actually be a good way of thinking about what we've got going on in the social sciences. This is due to the Innovation Fund in Denmark. We're looking at various social activities, social policies, a recreation of what the technology readiness level does for what we have in the social sciences. I'm not going to work through this, but I'm going to come back to a couple of them in just a minute. Because can we cast this onto what we have in hand already to recognise the space of things you might do given the overall ambitions, and then start seeing what else needs to be done in that space? Because after all, the projects we have so far are a very small part of the research and implementation we might seek to be doing, and how can we guide ourselves to probably understand what might be the barriers along the way taking this kind of schema. And the way I'm trying to help set up the panel discussion we'll be having shortly, some initial reflections, and maybe Gavin would like to come in at some point, but when we think back to the child trust funds and the junior ISAs, in some respects they're at level 8. They're actually in delivery mode. They're doing things right now. Implementation has led to a particular outcome, is there in the world. We can do further research to understand it and its consequences and actually go through patterns of refinement over time. One of the things you see a lot in this, I think my engineering company colleagues, rather than my engineering academic colleagues, are keen to point out, is that in engineering companies, you often create things that the science doesn't know about, and then you use the science to understand the thing that's been created. So practical action in the world creates things that the academic research can come in and actually help improve the implementation. And implementation can always be improved, it would seem. So I'd suggest that in that particular part of the activity, we're at that level. Step Ladder Plus, very interesting. Number of things going on, so there has been a look to the left and the right to see what incentivised education might deliver. It's an old idea in psychology, of course. Reward people and they do the thing you reward. But when we look at what we have there, well, we're probably about level 4. The problem's validated by both this work and what's been going on elsewhere. We've been through pilot testing, and then we've got to look at the ways in which we get an understanding of the impact, understanding about the long-term effects, as Tina was talking about, and how ready is society for this? When you try and implement programs like this, there will undoubtedly be pushback from all sorts of quarters at various points. That then sets up a research question. Who are they? What are they? How they operate? How can that hurdle be overcome? Come down to shares for data. Well, as we saw in the discussion we've had just now, seems like a great idea. We could see various ways in which we could see analogues of this. When we start doing the research, we might discover, damn it, that's a bad idea. That's one of the things about doing basic research. You have to have this kind of candid openness to understand that it looked like a great idea, but as we implement it, as we think about it, we may make discoveries which says that one's not going to fly. That then leads on to the question of what's next, and these are one of the ones at the end of my particular reflections on that, and you can see the psychologist sort of starts coming in. One of the things that strikes me as being brought to the fore in this work is questions about the psychology of the developing individual, the maturing mind. We've been very fond in many parts of social policy of thinking that people get into maturity in their adolescence. You go back a long time, people thought that actually quite young people were quite in a position to take responsibility for their actions. We now know from neuroscience research, brain maturation is really pressing on into the mid-20s. There are various aspects of how you understand yourself, how you understand your capacity to control, how you understand your capacity to plan, develops through until your mid to late 20s. So my thought was, how about we have some research into the ability to plan and control amongst these adolescent groups that are taking part in Step Ladder Plus? Maybe that will provide us with more insight into why a program works with some people and not others. Always in the academy we say there's a need for more research, as you're probably all thinking. But also these contexts of implementation. We know, and I think when Eric and Tina were talking earlier, when we've got an implementation, A, we have to bring in other things to make it possible, but B, there are circumstances in the environment of implementation that can either amplify or diminish, indeed flatten, the effect we're seeking to achieve. If we're properly to do implementation, we have to understand those factors. A lot of that then gets into research around normative belief structures. In one respect, as Gavin was saying, we're thinking about these as sovereign individuals, but sovereign individuals live in a social and political and economic context. They understand themselves through that. So maybe as we start going down this societal readiness pathway, we need to understand that a bit more. And then the stakeholders. Who's going to be convinced? Who needs to be convinced? And what's it going to take to convince them? There's lots of very good ideas out there that never come through into social policy because we can't convince the right people. How do we go about doing that? That's another set of very important questions of a more political kind, perhaps more sociological kind. That takes me all the way back to Harmeyer. All the things we're talking about, as Tina pointed out, have a long time horizon. How do we understand a trajectory into that distant future, where we would hope to see the impact of, say, for example, the young folks going through Stepladder Plus? What are they doing in their 40s? And we know from lots of psychological research that some of the things you see early on start manifesting themselves in, I'm sure a number of you know about the work of James Heckman. What you see is an impact, what's happening around age 4 or 5, in patterns of employment, paying your taxes, not being in prison, being in a stable relationship in your 20s and 30s. So how do we think about that trajectory? If we were to guide our adaptations of what we've started, what are those near-term measures? What are those in-between measures? And finally, of course, for all of this, cost and time. George Harmeyer, being director of DARPA, was very keen on how much of my budget are you going to take and when am I going to get delivery? And in perfectly reasonable questions. But if we're going to be in the business of supporting work of this type, there are questions we have to provide answers to. Why would anybody provide more funding unless we have good answers to those questions? Gavin, I put your name on the opening slide. Would you like to come in at this point? Reticent for once, you notice.
I think what David's done is to illustrate, the different stages in it. I mean, Michael put down a little challenge as far as David is concerned. We've got to recognise, we've got to examine what he says and really think about that carefully. That illustrates exactly what David is actually talking about.
I was very glad when Michael said it, actually. I thought, grist to the mill.
But at the same time, David's absolutely right. That we can show, we can demonstrate in some of the areas, that we're actually already a long way down the road. And Natasha has done that. I mean, the enthusiasm which Natasha puts in on a day-by-day basis in conversations with young people who spent, their whole lives so far in a desperate state of insecurity. It's so exciting, isn't it, to see this transformation. And, and you talk about the number of people who've gone through different steps and how they change as we go. It really is a good illustration of what David's actually talking about, moving from theory into looking for the evidence, putting it into the whole implementation process and working it through. So,
and very much it's about understanding the points of activity we have and the points of understanding we have and where the areas of darkness are still. Where are the areas where we have ignorance? We don't know what's going on. We need to turn on the light.
Yeah, that's right.
And so to understand the value of each of the different parts we've been hearing about, we need to get a grip on that bigger picture. Always very hard to do.
Yeah.
I mean, dare I quote dear old Donald Rumsfeld, it's the unknown unknowns that's going to be problematic for us.